Picture this. You wake up one morning and reach for your phone to check the time. But instead of tapping a screen, you're fumbling around in complete darkness. There's no light switch to flip, no warm shower waiting for you, and definitely no toilet just down the hall. Welcome to life before modern plumbing, where your daily routine would make a camping trip look like a luxury vacation. You might think you know what it was like back then, but trust me, the reality was far worse than anything you've imagined. We're talking about a time when taking a bath was a monthly event if you were lucky, and the idea of flushing your problems away was still centuries in the future. People lived their entire lives without ever experiencing the simple pleasure of turning a handle and watching clean water pour out. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into a world where your morning routine would have taken hours instead of minutes, and where the phrase "going to the bathroom" had a completely different meaning. This is what life was really like before modern plumbing. And spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. Let's start with the most basic human need after breathing and eating: dealing with waste. Today, you probably don't give it a second thought. You do your business, flush, wash your hands, and move on with your life. But imagine living in a world where that simple sequence didn't exist. Instead, you'd be dealing with chamber pots, outhouses, and waste disposal methods that would make your stomach turn. Chamber pots were basically portable toilets that sat under your bed or in a corner of your room. These ceramic or metal containers were your nighttime companion, and emptying them was part of your morning routine. The lucky families had servants to handle this delightful task, but most people had to dump their own waste into larger containers or directly onto the streets. Yes, you read that right. People literally threw their waste out of windows, often with nothing more than a shouted warning to anyone walking below. The smell alone would have been overwhelming. Cities reeked of human waste, rotting food, and animal droppings. Streets were like rivers of filth, especially when it rained, and everything mixed together into a disgusting soup that you'd have to wade through just to get from one place to another. Your sense of smell would have been constantly assaulted, and the idea of fresh air would have been foreign to anyone living in urban areas. For those who lived in rural areas, outhouses provided a slightly more civilized option, but they came with their own set of problems. These small wooden structures were typically built over deep pits, and when the pit filled up, you'd either dig a new one or find someone brave enough to empty it. The smell was trapped in these tiny spaces, making every visit an exercise in breath-holding. Winter visits were especially brutal, with freezing temperatures and the constant risk of falling through rotted floorboards. But waste disposal was just the beginning of your daily hygiene challenges. Water, something we take completely for granted today, was a precious commodity that required serious effort to obtain. There were no taps to turn, no water pressure to rely on, and definitely no hot water heaters waiting to provide instant warmth. Most people got their water from wells, rivers, or public fountains. This meant carrying heavy buckets or pots over long distances, sometimes multiple times a day. A single bucket of water might weigh 30 or 40 pounds when full, and you'd need several just to meet your basic needs. Washing clothes, cooking, drinking, and the occasional bath all required this precious resource that you had to work for. The quality of this water was questionable at best. Rivers and streams were contaminated with waste, dead animals, and industrial runoff. Wells could be tainted by nearby cesspits or animal waste. People had no way to test water quality, so they often drank from sources that would make modern health inspectors faint. Boiling water helped kill some bacteria, but most people didn't understand the science behind it, so they often skipped this crucial step. When it came to bathing, the experience was nothing like the relaxing showers or baths we enjoy today. First, you'd need to heat water over a fire, which could take hours depending on how much you needed. Then you'd pour it into a large metal tub, assuming you were wealthy enough to own one. Most people shared bath water with their entire family, starting with the father, then the mother, then the children in order of age. By the time the youngest child got their turn, the water was cold, dirty, and probably more contaminating than cleaning. Many people simply didn't bother with full baths very often. Once a month was considered frequent, and some people went months without immersing their bodies in water. Instead, they relied on quick washes of their hands, face, and other visible areas. The rest of their body remained unwashed for extended periods, leading to skin problems, body odor, and various health issues that we'd consider completely preventable today. Personal hygiene items that we consider essential were either non-existent or completely different from what we use now. Toothbrushes were luxury items that only the wealthy could afford, and even those were made with harsh animal bristles that could damage your gums. Most people cleaned their teeth with rough cloths, salt, or whatever abrasive materials they could find. Dental problems were incredibly common, and losing teeth at a young age was just accepted as part of life. Soap existed, but it was expensive and harsh. It was made from animal fats and strong alkaline substances that could irritate your skin. Many people made their own soap at home using whatever fats they could collect, resulting in products that were inconsistent in quality and often left your skin feeling raw and dry. Women faced additional challenges when it came to personal hygiene. Menstrual care consisted of rags that had to be washed and reused, assuming you were lucky enough to have access to clean rags in the first place. Privacy was limited, and discussing these matters was considered inappropriate. So many women suffered in silence without proper information or supplies. Laundry was an all-day affair that required enormous amounts of water, physical strength, and time. Clothes were boiled in large pots, scrubbed by hand against rough surfaces, and hung to dry wherever space allowed. The process was so labor-intensive that most people owned very few changes of clothing and wore the same garments for weeks at a time between washings. The wealthy had servants to handle these tasks, but even they lived in conditions that would shock us today. Servants slept in cramped quarters, often sharing beds and washing facilities. They worked long hours in environments filled with smoke, dust, and various unpleasant odors. Their access to clean water and bathing facilities was limited, despite the fact that they were responsible for maintaining cleanliness in their employers' homes. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Without understanding of bacteria and viruses, people had no idea how illnesses were transmitted. They often blamed supernatural causes or bad air for sicknesses that we now know were caused by poor sanitation and contaminated water. Cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases killed thousands of people who might have survived with access to clean water and proper waste disposal. The contrast between then and now is staggering. Today we complain if our shower takes too long to heat up or if the water pressure isn't quite right. We use hundreds of gallons of water daily without thinking twice about it. We have soap, shampoo, toothpaste, and countless other hygiene products that our ancestors couldn't have imagined. But here's the thing that really puts it all in perspective. The people living in those times didn't think their lives were particularly difficult because it was all they knew. They adapted to their circumstances because they had no choice. A person living in medieval times didn't wake up thinking about how miserable their life was compared to some future reality they couldn't imagine. They developed coping mechanisms and accepted standards that seem absolutely horrifying to us now. Children grew up thinking it was completely normal to share drinking water with animals, to sleep in the same clothes they'd worn all week, and to relieve themselves wherever convenient. They learned to ignore smells that would send us running for the hills. Their bodies adapted to conditions that would make modern humans violently ill within hours. But even within these harsh realities, there were social hierarchies that made some people's lives significantly worse than others. If you were born into poverty, your relationship with cleanliness was practically non-existent. Poor families lived in single-room dwellings where multiple generations shared cramped spaces with little to no ventilation. They had no access to soap, clean water was a luxury they couldn't afford, and changing clothes was impossible when you owned only one set. The wealthy, on the other hand, could afford to hire people to handle their waste, fetch their water, and maintain some semblance of cleanliness. They had servants whose entire job was to empty chamber pots, heat, bath water, and wash clothing. But even the richest people of the time lived in conditions that would be considered unsanitary by today's standards. Their grand estates still lacked running water, proper sewage systems, and reliable waste disposal. Cities were breeding grounds for disease and filth. London, Paris, and other major urban centers were essentially open sewers where waste flowed through streets and contaminated everything it touched. People walked through ankle-deep muck that contained human waste, dead animals, rotting food, and industrial byproducts. The wealthy tried to avoid this by traveling in carriages or sedan chairs, but even they couldn't escape the overwhelming stench that permeated every building and street. Rural areas weren't much better. Farm families dealt with animal waste constantly, and the line between human and animal living spaces was often blurred. Livestock shared living quarters with people during harsh weather, creating environments where disease could spread rapidly between species. Farmers worked in fields fertilized with human waste, walked barefoot through contaminated soil, and had no way to properly clean themselves afterward. The lack of understanding about germs and bacteria made everything worse. People didn't connect dirty water with illness, so they continued using contaminated sources without realizing the consequences. They didn't understand that washing hands could prevent disease transmission, so medical procedures were performed with dirty instruments and unwashed hands. Surgeons wore the same blood-stained aprons for multiple operations, and hospitals were places where you went to die rather than get better. Women giving birth faced incredible risks, not just from the birthing process itself, but from the unsanitary conditions surrounding it. Midwives had no concept of sterilization, and postpartum infections killed countless new mothers who might have survived with proper hygiene. Babies born into these conditions faced immediate health challenges that many couldn't overcome. The psychological impact of living in constant filth was something people just accepted as part of existence. Privacy was non-existent when it came to bodily functions. Families shared chamber pots, servants emptied them in front of everyone, and the sounds and smells of human waste were constant companions. People developed incredible tolerance for conditions that would traumatize us today. Food preparation and storage added another layer of health hazards to daily life. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly and was often eaten in various stages of decay. Flies and other insects swarmed over food preparation areas, spreading bacteria and contamination. Cooking surfaces were rarely cleaned properly, and the same utensils were used for raw meat and other foods without washing between uses. Water storage was problematic too. Large containers sat open to the air, collecting dust, insects, and other contaminants. Families drank from communal vessels that were shared by everyone, including sick family members. The concept of individual drinking cups or glasses was foreign to most people, so diseases spread rapidly through households via shared eating and drinking implements. Seasonal changes brought different challenges. Summer heat intensified odors and accelerated the decomposition of waste, making cities nearly unbearable. Flies and other insects multiplied rapidly, spreading disease and making every meal a battle against contamination. Winter brought its own problems as waste froze in streets and chamber pots, creating solid masses of filth that had to be chipped away when spring arrived. The clothing people wore reflected their limited cleaning options. Fabrics were thick and heavy, designed to last long periods between washings. Undergarments were changed infrequently, if at all, and outer garments were worn until they literally fell apart. The wealthy might have multiple sets of clothing, but even they wore garments for extended periods without cleaning. Body odor was masked with perfumes and powders rather than eliminated through bathing. Professional occupations came with their own hygiene challenges. Blacksmiths worked covered in soot and ash. Tanners dealt with animal hides and harsh chemicals, and butchers were constantly covered in blood and animal waste. These workers had no way to properly clean themselves after work, so they carried the remnants of their trades home to their families every night. The irony is that many of the solutions to these problems existed in primitive forms, but social customs and lack of knowledge prevented their widespread adoption. Some cultures had developed better hygiene practices, but information traveled slowly and change was resisted. People clung to familiar methods even when better alternatives were available, partly because change was expensive and partly because tradition was deeply ingrained. Religious beliefs sometimes made hygiene worse rather than better. Some groups believed that bathing was sinful, or that suffering through filth was a form of penance. Others thought that illness was divine punishment that shouldn't be prevented through cleanliness. These attitudes persisted for centuries and contributed to the acceptance of unsanitary conditions. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of pre-plumbing life was how recently these conditions existed. We're not talking about ancient civilizations or distant historical periods. Many of these realities persisted well into the modern era, and in some parts of the world, similar conditions still exist today. The transformation to modern sanitation happened remarkably quickly in historical terms, but slowly enough that there are still people alive who remember life before indoor plumbing became standard. Human ingenuity eventually solved these problems, but it took thousands of years of trial and error, scientific advancement, and social change to reach the point where clean water and proper sanitation became basic expectations rather than impossible luxuries. The transition from these horrific conditions to our modern world didn't happen overnight. It took centuries of gradual improvements, scientific breakthroughs, and social revolutions to create the sanitary paradise we live in today. But even as things slowly got better, the process was messy, expensive, and met with resistance from people who couldn't imagine life any other way. The first major breakthrough came when people started connecting dirty water with disease. This sounds obvious now, but it was revolutionary thinking at the time. Doctors and scientists had to fight against centuries of established beliefs about what caused illness. Some thought sickness came from bad air. Others blamed supernatural forces, and many simply accepted disease as an unavoidable part of life. When the connection between contaminated water and cholera outbreaks was finally proven, it sparked the first real push for better sanitation systems. Cities began investing in infrastructure that would carry waste away from populated areas instead of letting it accumulate in streets and basements. This was incredibly expensive work that required digging up entire neighborhoods and rerouting the flow of human waste. The wealthy were the first to benefit from these improvements naturally. They could afford to install the earliest versions of indoor toilets and water pipes in their homes. These primitive systems were far from perfect and often broke down, flooding houses with sewage or leaving families without water for days at a time. But they represented a massive leap forward from chamber pots and outdoor privies. Working-class families had to wait much longer for these luxuries to become affordable and widely available. Even when public water systems were installed in the cities, many homes couldn't afford the connection fees or the ongoing costs of piped water. So they continued using wells, public fountains, and whatever sources they could access for free, even as wealthier neighborhoods enjoyed the convenience of indoor plumbing. The installation process itself was a nightmare that disrupted entire communities. Streets were torn up for months at a time, while workers laid pipes and built sewage systems. Houses were invaded by plumbers who had to break through walls and floors to install the necessary infrastructure. Families were forced to live in construction zones while their homes were essentially rebuilt around them. Many people resisted these changes because they didn't trust the new systems or couldn't afford them. There were legitimate concerns about the safety and reliability of early plumbing. Pipes burst regularly, contaminating drinking water with sewage. Gas leaks from primitive water heaters killed people in their sleep. The technology was improving rapidly, but it was still dangerous and unpredictable. Cultural attitudes also had to shift dramatically. The idea of bringing water and waste disposal indoors seemed unnatural and potentially harmful to many people. They worried about contaminating their living spaces or attracting disease by having toilets inside their homes. Some religious groups opposed indoor plumbing as an affront to natural order or divine will. Women's roles began changing as household tasks became less labor-intensive. The endless cycle of hauling water, heating it over fires, and hand-washing everything slowly gave way to systems that made these jobs easier and faster. But this transition also eliminated many traditional skills and changed the dynamics of family life in ways that people struggle to understand and accept. So the next time you flip on a light switch or turn a faucet handle, take a moment to appreciate the incredible journey that brought us from chamber pots and contaminated wells to the clean, convenient world we live in today. Modern plumbing didn't just change how we handle waste and water, it revolutionized human health, extended our lifespans, and gave us the freedom to focus on bigger things than just staying alive. We've come a long way from those dark, smelly days, and honestly, that's something worth celebrating every single day.